Because the second Remy Ma jumped on W.Y.F.L and started firing at Papoose and Claressa Shields, this stopped being some little messy relationship update and turned into a full credibility war over who has been telling the truth, who has been performing for the cameras, and who has been trying to control the story while pretending they are above the story. And that is the part one need everybody to sit with for a second, because a lot of people are still reacting to this like it is just gossip, when it actually looks much bigger than gossip. It looks like a public image collapse in slow motion. You have Remy reclaiming her pen on a record released around April 10th. You have public reporting that Papoose filed for divorce in May 2025. You have Claressa doing interviews insisting she is not with somebody's husband. And you have this entire thing unfolding in front of an audience that has spent years being sold one version of who the mature one is, who the victim is, and who the unstable one is. That is why this matters. This is not just about bars. This is about narrative ownership. This is about what happens when the person everybody tried to speak over decides to speak in the one language that cannot be easily spun: direct, public, lyrical response. And when we get to the part about why those ghostwriting bars matter, and why the divorce timeline matters even more, you are going to understand why the loudest people in this whole mess may actually be the least comfortable with the facts that are already on the table. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now let's slow this down and set the table properly, because one of the biggest mistakes people make with stories like this is acting like the latest clip is the whole story. It never is. Remy Ma and Papoose were one of those couples that got packaged in the culture as durable, loyal, and built different. That image carried real weight. It was bigger than rap. It fed into interviews, public appearances, reality TV energy, relationship branding, and this whole idea that whatever else was messy in hip-hop, this pair was supposed to represent stability. Then the cracks got harder and harder to ignore. Rumors swirled for a long time. Remy was publicly linked in gossip cycles to Easy the Block Captain. Papoose and Remy's separation became more openly discussed. Then in December 2024, things escalated when Remy publicly accused Papoose of dealing with Claressa Shields and shared alleged messages that threw gasoline on everything. From there, the clean narrative was gone. It was not private issues anymore. It was open warfare. And the stakes here are not small. Musically, this matters because Remy is not just talking. She is using records to answer a public attack on her credibility, especially the old claim that Papoose allegedly wrote most of her bars. Reputation-wise, this matters because Papoose built a lot of public goodwill off being seen as the calm, loyal, stand-up guy. Claressa, on the other side, is not some random internet personality. She is one of the most accomplished boxers of her generation, and every time her name gets tied deeper into this feud, the conversation shifts from her athletic legacy to relationship drama. Financially and professionally, that matters. Media attention is not always good attention. Trending is not the same as winning. Being the headline every week does not automatically turn into endorsements, leverage, or respect. Culturally, this matters because the audience is being asked to choose between image and pattern. Do you believe the brand that was sold? Or do you believe the repeated public contradictions, the lyrical responses, the interviews, the timeline confusion, and the escalating need to keep explaining the same relationship over and over again? That is the real question driving this whole situation. And I think we need to set the record straight on one more thing before we go any further. The reason this story keeps living is not just because the people involved are famous. It keeps living because every new public statement reopens the exact wound everybody claims they want closed. If you really want peace, why are you still feeding the algorithm with fresh explanations, fresh interviews, fresh clarifications, fresh posture? Why does every attempt to look above it somehow end with another clip, another quote, another response cycle? That is why viewers keep circling back. The story is not just messy. It is structurally unresolved. One side keeps signaling, sign the papers, end this cleanly. Another side keeps sounding like, no, wait, let me explain my side one more time. And in a public feud, the person who keeps needing one more explanation is often the person least comfortable with where public opinion might land if the talking ever stopped. So let's get into the visible evidence, because this is where a lot of the conversation starts getting very inconvenient for the spin team. Evidence number one is the record itself. On April 10th, Remy Ma dropped W.Y.F.L through On the Radar, and it was not subtle. The track directly appears to address both Papoose and Claressa Shields, with bars aimed at someone doing the most and, more importantly, bars aimed at the idea that somebody else wrote her records. That matters because it was not random shade. It was a targeted rebuttal to a public narrative that had already been floating around since Papoose previously claimed he wrote most of her rhymes. In other words, Remy did not just drop a diss. She attacked the foundation of a talking point that could diminish her entire career. And when artists go at authorship, that is not petty. That is existential. In rap, you are not just arguing about feelings. You are arguing about legacy, skill, and ownership of your own name. Think about how calculated that is. Out of everything she could have focused on, Remy zeroed in on the one claim that tries to reduce her from artist to vessel. That is not accidental. That is somebody saying, no, we are not doing revisionist history on my pen. And that is why the record hit the way it hit. Some people heard relationship drama. Others heard a veteran rapper making sure the public does not get too comfortable disrespecting her craftsmanship. Listen, that is a different level of response. Anybody can rant. Anybody can post a story. Anybody can hop on live and talk for an hour. But when you respond in a format that directly reinforces the exact talent people said you did not own, that is a strategic move. Does everybody understand how crazy that actually is? Evidence number 2 is what had already been public long before this latest song, those December 2024 alleged text screenshots reported by Hip Hop DX. According to that report, Remy publicly shared messages that appeared to show Claressa expressing frustration toward Papoose and talking in a way that suggested a much deeper emotional involvement than a casual situation. Whether every detail in those screenshots tells the whole truth is a different conversation, but the public effect was devastating because it took the story out of rumor space and pushed it into receipt space. And in public conflicts, receipt space changes the temperature. Once the audience believes they are looking at direct communication, even alleged direct communication, the burden shifts. Now the people involved are not just denying vibes. They are explaining context. And context explanations almost always arrive too late to beat the screenshot. And here is the part where the so-called calm, mature image starts wobbling. Because once those messages entered the public bloodstream, this was no longer a theoretical rumor about who might be talking to whom. It became a question of timeline, honesty, and presentation. If the relationship was clean, why did it look messy? If everything was above board, why did the public need so many follow-up explanations? If nobody crossed lines, why did the optics land like this? Those are fair questions. Those are not hate questions. Those are pattern questions. And a lot of people online love to hide behind "y'all are just messy" when the truth is the mess is public because the participants made it public. Evidence number 3 came when TMZ reported on May 22, 2025 that Remy spent more than 80 minutes on Instagram Live discussing Papoose and Claressa. According to TMZ's summary, Remy claimed she and Papoose had not shared a bet since May 2022, said she had been letting the public believe in the old black love image, and pushed for him to sign divorce papers so everybody could move on. That detail matters because it reframes the story from sudden crash out to long breakdown finally being narrated out loud. If somebody is saying the relationship was effectively over behind the scenes long before the audience fully accepted it, then the public branding becomes part of the story itself. Not just the breakup. The packaging of the breakup. And let me pause right there because this is where people love to get selective. When Remy speaks at length, some folks call it too much. But when years of image management collapse into one long explanation, what exactly do you think that sounds like? Polite? Neat? Curated? No. It sounds ugly. It sounds emotional. It sounds like someone dragging the backstage into the main room. That does not automatically make every claim proven, but it does explain the intensity. And once you hear that the private reality may have been disconnected from the public branding for a long time, suddenly the whole feud stops looking like random chaos and starts looking like a delayed invoice. Evidence number 4 is Claressa Shields' own interview trail, because this is where the cultural contradiction gets impossible to ignore. In July 2025, Complex reported that Claressa pushed back on being described as involved with somebody's husband, saying Papoose had filed for divorce and that people were refusing to say that word. She also said divorce takes time and framed the situation as one people were twisting to fit a narrative. Now, to be fair, that is a real point. Divorce does take time. Public relationships do get distorted. But here is the issue. If you keep having to publicly argue the same legitimacy point, that tells you the public never fully bought the clean timeline. And when the public never buys the clean timeline, you do not have a settled love story. You have a reputational dispute still under appeal. So what do all 4 of these visible moments tell us? They tell us this feud is not running on one incident. It is running on accumulated contradiction. A diss record challenging authorship. Alleged screenshots suggesting emotional overlap. A long live stream reframing the marriage timeline. Interviews trying to formalize a legitimacy argument after the public already smelled smoke. That is why every new clip hits harder than it would in a normal breakup story. This is not one event. It is a pileup. And when you have a pileup like that, one side does not need to win every single point. They just need to show the audience there is enough inconsistency to stop trusting the old narrative. And oh, do I have more for you? Because once we move from the visible receipts to the cultural reaction around the story, the picture gets even more uncomfortable for anybody still trying to act like this is just one bitter person refusing to let go. And oh, do I have more for you? Because the second the story leaves the direct participants and enters the hands of artists, radio personalities, blogs, and the wider hip-hop audience, that is when you see what the culture is really feeling. And some of the people who want to act like this is just Remy being mad are not going to like this next part at all. Because the problem for the sympathy tour crowd is that the culture does not only respond to the words. It responds to the energy under the words. It responds to who sounds practiced, who sounds defensive, who sounds fed up, and who sounds like they are trying to clean something after the stain already set. And when we get to how other names in the space reacted around W.Y.F.L, plus why Claressa keeps getting pulled into media exchanges that should have nothing to do with her boxing greatness, you are going to see why the narrative has been slipping long before some people were ready to admit it. One cultural clue came immediately after W.Y.F.L dropped. Complex reported that Fat Joe reposted the track on Instagram with heavy support, and that names like Memphis Bleak, Murda Mook, Mia X, and Milliz showed love in the comments. Now, let's be adults here. That does not mean every one of those artists is endorsing every allegation in this feud. That is not what it means. What it does mean is that people inside the music ecosystem heard the record and did not treat it like nonsense. They treated it like an event. They treated it like Remy stepping back into a position people still recognize her in, dangerous when she is focused, sharp, and speaking in bars instead of whispers. That matters because culture reactions are a kind of vote. Not a legal vote. A temperature vote. And the temperature there was not, oh no, why is she doing this? It was more like, oh, she's talking. That is a very different vibe. Another cultural clue is how this story kept crossing out of rap and into sports media spaces that were supposed to be about Claressa's own accomplishments. Once your championship resume keeps having to share room with relationship clarification, that is not a random accident anymore. That is brand interference. Claressa is genuinely an all-time boxer. That should be the headline. But public coverage kept pulling her back into explanations about Remy, Papoose, divorce timing, and whether her relationship should be seen as legitimate or tainted. That is the cost of entering a narrative before the old narrative is fully buried. The audience stops separating your excellence from your entanglement. And that is unfair in one sense, but it is also predictable. You cannot keep stepping into public microphones around an unresolved relationship saga and then act shocked that the saga follows you onto the stage. A third cultural clue came in the very wording of Claressa's defenses. When someone says, in effect, I'm not with somebody's husband, he filed for divorce, that is not a flex. That is a legalistic rebuttal. And legalistic rebuttals almost always tell you the emotional court of public opinion is still unconvinced. People who feel fully secure in how their story is being received usually do not keep reaching for procedural language. They say, this is my person, period. But when you hear repeated emphasis on filing dates, ongoing process, and technical status, you are hearing someone trying to close a gap between how they see the relationship and how the audience sees it. That gap is everything. Because public narrative lives in gaps. If there were no gap, there would be no endless appetite for the story. Now, I do want to acknowledge a counterargument here, because nuance actually matters. There are people who will say, hold on. If a marriage is functionally over and a divorce has been filed, then the public needs to stop acting like nobody can move on until a court finishes paperwork. And honestly, that is not a crazy point. That is a real point. Life does not freeze because legal systems move slow. But here is where that argument falls apart in this specific case. The issue is not only whether people moved on. The issue is the overlap between public image, alleged private behavior, repeated public explanation, and the way the story kept being fed in drips through lives, posts, interviews, and songs. That is why the audience keeps doubting. It is not just the timing. It is the total choreography. A fourth cultural clue is that the ghostwriting claim keeps refusing to die. Why? Because authorship is one of the deepest pressure points in hip-hop identity. Once Papoose allegedly positioned himself as the man behind so much of Remy's pen, he did not just shade her. He tried to alter how the culture remembers her accomplishments. So when Remy uses a public diss to answer that specifically, the culture hears more than relationship pain. It hears a veteran rapper saying, "Do not edit me out of my own story." That is why the record traveled. That is why people reacted. That is why the audience did not just reduce it to tabloid content. It landed at the intersection of romance, ego, artistry, and historical credit. That is where hip-hop gets very serious, very fast. And I know some people on the other side are going to say, y'all are only taking Remy seriously because she raps better. Well, first of all, this is rap. Being the better rapper does matter in a rap-framed conflict. But more importantly, lyrical control changes perception because it creates hierarchy. The person who can make the cleaner, sharper, more replayable public case often ends up sounding more believable, even when not every allegation is fully proven. That is why diss records are dangerous. They do not only attack facts. They attack confidence. They attack posture. They make the other side look like they are constantly arriving late to their own defense. And this is where the gear shift has to happen, because if you still think this whole thing is mainly about who said what to whom, you are still looking at the bottom layer. The real story is the machine underneath it, the economics of image, the branding value of being seen as loyal or stable, the media incentive to keep every contradiction alive, and the way authorship claims function like ownership claims in rap. This is where it stops being entertainment-y and starts looking like a case study in how celebrity narratives are built, monetized, and then weaponized when they begin to crack. First, systemic angle. Relationship branding is an asset. Let's call it what it is. In modern celebrity culture, especially in hip-hop adjacent spaces, a couple's image is not just personal. It has market value. It shapes interview tone, audience loyalty, engagement, and long-form public trust. Black love, loyalty, endurance, sacrifice, standing by somebody through prison or hard times, those are not just emotional ideas. They are symbolic currency. Once a couple gets attached to that currency, walking away clean becomes harder because you are not only leaving a person. You are leaving a story that people have invested in. So if Remy is saying, according to TMZ, that the audience was allowed to believe in one version while something very different was happening privately, that is not just a relationship confession. That is an allegation that a brand remained active after the emotional reality had expired. And if that is even partly true, then this feud is also about who benefited from that brand staying alive for as long as it did. Second, systemic angle. In rap, ghostwriting allegations are not random shade. They are attempts to redistribute credit capital. If one artist can successfully convince the public that another artist's signature records were largely written by them, they gain symbolic ownership over a career chapter that is not officially theirs. That is enormous. That can reshape fan memory, media framing, even future interviews. Suddenly, every old verse gets revisited through a new lens. Every compliment comes with an asterisk. So when Papoose allegedly made that kind of claim, and Remy later answered it on wax, what we are watching is not just exes arguing. We are watching a fight over catalog memory. Who gets remembered as the architect? Who gets remembered as the face? And once that battle begins, it becomes rational for the person being diminished to respond hard, because silence starts looking like permission. Third, systemic angle. Media ecosystems profit from unstable resolution. Think about how many versions of this story exist at once. Blog summary. Radio interview clip. Instagram live recap. Song lyric breakdown. Old screenshot resurfacing. New quote from a sports interview. Another outlet summarizing another outlet. The machine loves stories that can be reactivated by one sentence. Why? Because unresolved celebrity tension is renewable content. It costs almost nothing to revive, and it guarantees engagement from multiple tribes at once. Rap fans, relationship commentators, sports fans, gossip consumers, people who hate one side, people who defend the other. That means everybody involved is operating inside an environment that rewards continuation, not closure. So even if one person sincerely wants it over, the structure around them keeps paying for it to stay alive. And this is where I need to say something that some people are not going to want to hear. The media does not need a story to be fully solved. It needs the story to stay emotionally legible. As long as the public can understand the roles, hurt spouse, new partner, contested timeline, questioned authorship, loyalty image, messy transition, the machine can keep printing content. That is why a story like this can outlive the actual relationship. The feud becomes the product. The analysis becomes the product. The correction becomes the product. Even the denial becomes the product. And once you realize that, you stop asking, why won't this go away, and start asking, who benefits every time it comes back? There is another layer here too, and it is the ugliest one, gendered credibility. Let's have the real conversation. Women in public conflicts are often required to present perfect emotional discipline if they want to be believed. The moment they get loud, repetitive, bitter-sounding, or raw, a portion of the audience tries to downgrade everything they say to drama. But the exact same audience will sometimes hear a man make sweeping authorship claims, fidelity claims, or character claims and treat those as grounded until disproven. So when Remy answers in a way that is intense, aggressive, and emotionally obvious, some people instantly mark that as instability. But if the underlying issue is that she is fighting both a relationship narrative and a talent narrative at the same time, then intensity makes more sense. I am not saying intensity proves accuracy. I am saying the audience often punishes women for the presentation of anger long before it examines the substance underneath it. And on the Claressa side, another gendered trap shows up. Because for all her excellence, once she enters a highly visible unresolved love triangle narrative, some people stop seeing the athlete first and start seeing the other woman archetype first, whether that framing is fair or not. That is exactly why this whole situation is so damaging from a brand standpoint. It shrinks everybody. It pulls Remy toward scorned ex, Papoose toward image manager husband, and Claressa toward constant relationship explainer, when each person has a larger public identity than that. But the machine loves the smaller, messier role. It is easier to monetize. So what is the conclusion all three systemic angles point toward? Simple. This public war is not sustained by feelings alone. It is sustained by incentives. Incentive to protect a legacy. Incentive to preserve authorship credit. Incentive to defend a current relationship. Incentive to maintain public likability. Incentive for media platforms to keep the conflict warm. Incentive for fans to fight it like team sports. That is why the story feels endless. It is not endless because nobody knows how to stop. It is endless because too many moving parts get something out of continuation. And now we get to the truth bomb, the part the whole story has been circling around the entire time. To me, the biggest reveal is not simply that Remy dropped a diss, or that Claressa defended the relationship, or that Papoose filed paperwork. The biggest reveal is that this entire public saga appears to be, at its core, a battle over narrative legitimacy after the original power arrangement stopped holding. That is the real earthquake. The old arrangement, whatever it truly was behind the scenes, seems to have depended on a shared story, a stable union, a clear loyal guy image, a manageable public face, and a controlled understanding of who contributed what. Once that shared story broke, everybody started fighting over the debris. And the person with the most to lose in a narrative collapse is often the person whose public identity depended most heavily on the old version remaining believable. That is why the victim framing keeps feeling shaky to a lot of viewers. Not because hurt cannot exist on multiple sides. It can. Not because breakups do not get ugly. They do. But because the repeated public behavior does not neatly match the clean victim script. The ghostwriting claim muddies it. The alleged screenshots muddy it. The endless explanation loop muddies it. The continued need to clarify legitimacy muddies it. The result is a story where no single statement can fully restore the old image, because the issue is no longer one statement. It is cumulative doubt. And cumulative doubt is brutal. You cannot beat it with one interview. You cannot beat it with one caption. You cannot beat it with technicalities alone. Once the audience starts feeling like the image was managed too tightly for too long, every new defense sounds less like resolution and more like maintenance. What I think happened here, and I want to be clear that this is analysis, not a courtroom finding, is that Remy recognized the real battlefield was never just romance. It was credibility. So she did what rappers do when they think the public record is being edited against them. She made a counter-record. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for a neat panel discussion. She attacked the version of history she believed was being built around her. That is why W.Y.F.L matters beyond gossip. It is not just a diss. It is a refusal to let somebody else narrate her talent and her timeline without resistance. And whether people agree with every single bar or not, that motive makes complete sense. Meanwhile, Claressa's position gets harder the longer the story stays active, because the more she explains, the more she gets fused to the conflict. And Papoose's position gets harder too, because the more the public revisits these competing stories, the more his once simple image now carries permanent questions. That is the truth bomb. Nobody in this saga is fighting over one event anymore. They're fighting over what history will say this whole period meant. Was it betrayal? Was it overlap after a dead marriage? Was it brand collapse? Was it delayed truth-telling? Was it a control battle over talent credit and public sympathy? That is the actual war. And once you understand that, everything starts clicking. The songs, the screenshots, the interviews, the divorce status talk, the emotional lives, the commentary ecosystem around them. None of it is random. It is a narrative land grab. Everybody is trying to leave the public with a final sentence. But the problem is, in messy public endings, there is rarely one final sentence. There is only the sentence people repeat most often. And right now, the sentence winning is not everything was clean and simple. The sentence winning is something about this has not added up for a long time. The emotional landing point, though, is actually pretty clear to me. The person who still benefits the most in the long run is the person who can survive the noise and remain legible in their core gift. For Remy, that gift is rapping. For Claressa, that gift is boxing. For Papoose, historically, it has been lyricism and reputation. The difference is that in this chapter, the one who seemed most able to convert the chaos back into their native strength was Remy. She went back to the pen. That matters. She did not need everybody to agree with her personally. She needed enough people to remember what she sounds like when she is locked in. And they did. That does not mean the others are finished. Let's not be dramatic in the lazy way. Claressa is still an elite athlete. Papoose is still a known name with years in the culture. But in terms of this specific conflict, the person who looked most like they were regaining control was the one who turned commentary back into craft. One person kept getting pulled deeper into explanation. The other turned explanation into art. That is a powerful difference. One person is trying to close the loop with paperwork and public defense. The other took the loop, put it on beat, and made the audience argue about bars instead of just biographies. And I want everybody listening to really think about that. Because this is why integrity in public conflicts is not always about appearing calmest. Sometimes integrity looks like refusing to let a false or incomplete version of you harden into accepted truth. Sometimes it looks messy in real time. Sometimes it sounds angry. Sometimes it sounds repetitive. But if the central fight is over your voice, then using your voice is not a breakdown. It is the defense. While the image managers are still trying to patch the window, the artist everyone counted out just reminded people she still owns the room when the mic is on. That is the contrast. One side kept reaching for narrative control. The other side reached for the craft. So yes, I think the right person is still winning in the only way that holds up over time, by reconnecting to the actual thing that made the culture care in the first place. Talent lasts longer than captions. Skill lasts longer than spin. And if the public keeps having to choose between a polished explanation and a sharp record, do not be shocked when the record hits harder every single time. And the wild part is, this is only the start. Because there are at least two obvious developments still hanging over this whole saga. The first is whether the legal and relational status on the Papoose side ever reaches a point where the explanation cycle can finally stop. If that does not happen cleanly, the audience is going to keep treating every new statement like a live grenade. The second is whether Remy turns this moment into a longer musical run, because if W.Y.F.L was not just a one-off vent session, but the opening shot of a more sustained lyrical return, then the people who tried to reduce this to gossip are going to have a much bigger problem on their hands. The conversation could shift from "look at this mess" to "wait a minute, is she really back outside like that?" And if that happens, then the entire feud changes shape again. Because then the biggest consequence of all this would be that the chaos accidentally reactivated and artist people had gotten too comfortable discussing like a rumor instead of a threat. That is why you have to stay locked in on stories like this. Not because the mess is fun, though. Let's be honest, the internet loves a mess, but because sometimes the mess reveals a career pivot hiding underneath it. Sometimes the breakup story is really the reentry story. Sometimes the public embarrassment becomes the pressure that forces somebody back into their gift. So if you made it this far, you already know this was never just about who posted what. This was about narrative, authorship, image, and who gets to define the ending of a chapter the culture thought it already understood. Drop your take below, because I already know the comments are going to be split between the people still defending the old storyline and the people who think the mask slipped a long time ago. And if you want the next video, the one I would absolutely line up right after this, it is the deeper breakdown of how ghostwriting accusations between exes become full-on legacy warfare in hip-hop. Because once an artist's pen gets challenged by someone who used to share their private world, that is not ordinary shade anymore. That is a catalog-level war. And trust me, that conversation gets even darker than this one.